The structural analysis in this book, In Search of Respect, refers to a social series which explores social phenomena and institutions by examining the interconnectedness between tangible entities like individuals and organizations, using these relationships as the primary lens to understand social behavior. The author, Philippe Bourgois, originally wanted to write a book on poverty and ethnic segregation in New York City. He knew the drug world would be a part of that discussion, but watching his community sell and smoke crack and it becoming a multi-billion-dollar industry right before his eyes, as well as his neighborhood being ravaged by these drugs, caused the drug epidemic to be one of his main topics for his research and book, which ultimately gives insight of the deeper dynamics and social marginalization of the struggles in East Harlem. 39.8% of East Harlem people live below the federal poverty line, compared to 16.3% of all New Yorkers, according to the 1990 census, meaning that 62.1% of the population earn less than twice the official poverty level in areas like East Harlem. Hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers are able to survive on the meager comforts that Americans consider essential thanks to the vast, untaxed, and uncensused underground economy of the drug trade. Both men and women had side hustles to combat the everyday cost of living, whether women were prostituting or babysitting, and men were repairing cars to nickel and diming, which is another term for selling drugs. Cocaine and crack during the 80s and the 90s, followed by heroin in the mid 90s, has been the fastest growing, if not only equal opportunity employers of men in Harlem, as said by Bourgois. The drug business was easily the highest form of income compared to other income generating opportunities, both legal and illegal. Being able to walk 100 yards outside of his home and obtain not one but multiple drugs and needles put Bourgois smack dab in the middle of his anthropological work. Bourgois asked the question of why should these young men and women travel downtown on the subway to make minimum wage in an office job where they can typically make more money, at least temporarily, selling drugs on the street corner in front of their apartment or schoolyard. And this, I believe, is the same way the people of East Harlem saw it as well. According to the comparative social indicators by neighborhood from a 1990 census, the total population in East Harlem was about 110,000, 52% being Puerto Rican, 39% being African American, and in total 40% of residents being below the poverty line. In turn, the population involved in or related to crack houses was about 11,000. Puerto Ricans made up 56%, while African Americans made up 33%, and 49% being below the poverty line. Overall, in New York City, the population was about 7 million, Puerto Ricans being 12% and African Americans being 25%, and the total number of residents below the poverty line being 19%. This shows the massive difference between the city of East Harlem being affected by poverty overall more than New York City. The cultural assault that El Barrio teenagers frequently experience when they leave their neighborhood exacerbates the suffering of growing up impoverished in the wealthiest city in the world. In Bourgois's words, the term inner city street culture is a complex and conflictual web of beliefs, symbols, modes of interactions, values, and ideologies that have emerged in opposition to exclusion from the mainstream society. Street culture offers an alternative form of autonomous personal dignity. Despite racism and economic marginalization, the United States socially underprivileged groups' concentration in politically and environmentally secluded inner city enclaves have sparked an explosion of creative culture. Street culture ultimately becomes an active force in individual degeneration and communal destruction, while having originated from a personal quest for dignity, and a rejection of racism and oppression. In the context of political and ideological oppression, the extreme reactions to poverty and segregation exemplified by the dealers and addicts in this book provide insight into processes that may be encountered in one way or another by significant segments of any vulnerable population going through rapid cultural or structural changes. The speed with which the United States colonized and disarticulated Puerto Rico's economy and polity has made the human cost of immigration and poverty increasingly evident in El Barrio. Contrary to this statement, one thing that is clear is that in the lives of second and third generation immigrants, Puerto Rican culture expressions have persisted in growing and redefining themselves around the recurring subject of autonomy and dignity. Before interacting with anyone from the drug business to learn more about the culture and nature of drugs and poverty in El Barrio, Burgoyne had to overcome a system of legalized racial and segregation that separates people based on race and class, also known as class-based apartheid. This was because whenever he did try to interact with people from the community who lived in these conditions, they only saw a white man who could potentially be an undercover agent or any member of law enforcement. It was either a cop or his biggest stereotype, a white drug addict. He himself was harassed and searched by New York City police officers for being profiled as a drug user. With inner city street culture comes the term street smart, meaning having the experience and knowledge necessary to deal with the potential difficulties or dangers of life in an urban environment. This was something Burgoyne lacked with one of his informants, whom he called Ray, a crack dealer who was well respected within the streets of El Barrio. In learning that Ray couldn't read, he realized his mistake too late when he handed Ray a newspaper to read, in turn embarrassing Ray, something you should never do in fear of retaliation. Stories of Ray's violent streak and mentions of rape gives Ray power over the streets, but at the same time are self-destructive. In the weeks following the newspaper fiasco, Burgoyne avoided Ray so that no confrontation would occur with the help of his other informants who were seemingly friendlier than Ray. The two informants were Caesar and Primo. One day, Ray told Primo that he had foreboding dreams about Burgoyne being a member of law enforcement, or at least that is how it was articulated. This was taken seriously within the Puerto Rican community because in their culture, dreams have a powerful and symbolic significance. Eventually, avoiding Ray worked in favor of Burgoyne because when he did run into Ray again, tension seemed to have died down and Burgoyne was seemingly back in Ray's good graces. Despite Ray's success in the streets, he lacked cultural capital, which is a sociological concept that describes the social assets that people have that can help them achieve success in social mobility. In this society, everything is about how others perceive you and view you as an individual. Eventually learning to adapt to his surroundings, as in knowing how and what to say to law enforcement and learning the rules of the street, he had a better understanding of how to sustain relationships with people within the community. Stereotyping was at an all-time high, especially in El Barrio. Middle-class outsiders and people of the white community preferred not visiting poor urban neighborhoods because to them it was the common sense that it was too dangerous. Anthropologist Michael Taussig founded the term culture of terror, which is defined as to convey the dominating effect of widespread violence on a vulnerable society, which is exactly the society in which people lived in El Barrio. Images of a culture of terror are unknowingly used by mainstream society to dehumanize victims and perpetrators and to defend its refusal to address issues of segregation, economic marginalization, and public sector collapse. Although Burgoyne discussed the immense violence and poverty in El Barrio, he also stated that despite these lows, there were also a sense of community in the neighborhood. Sometimes struggle brings people together. In places like El Barrio, police brutality was almost normalized, and it did not matter if you were black, brown, or white. If you lived in the neighborhood, to the police, you were considered trash or less than, ultimately needing to be portrayed as such when dealing with law enforcement. Back then, drugs had names according to dealers, like Primo, who sold his drug with the name We Are the World. Speedballs were a combination of heroin and cocaine. Most drugs were packaged as 10, 15, 20, and $25 bags. The African American and Puerto Rican divide was apparent in El Barrio. There was segregation amongst the two. Although majority of El Barrio was Hispanic, there was a presence of African Americans, and the atmosphere was always a bit hostile when Burgoyne would ask the opinions of the few African Americans present. The oppressive colonial background of their ancestors and great-grandparents must be considered while analyzing second and third generation Puerto Rican immigrants in New York City. Puerto Ricans began entering the neighborhoods around the 1930s and 40s, replacing Italians and Jewish people in factories and rundown apartment buildings. The inability to attain a sustainable form of political and economic growth over the previous century has resulted in what is essentially one of the most significant population displacements of the 20th century. In the 1960s, about 586,000 Puerto Ricans started to seek new living conditions and jobs in the ghettos of New York City. Puerto Ricans born in New York City are the descendants of a displaced people running a marathon dash through economic history. In reference to Puerto Rico's economy in the 1990s, there is no single country in the world that produces as much net income for the U.S. company as Puerto Rico, says their governor. In New York's inner city, the massive changes that were pushed so quickly on the traditionally rural Puerto Rican population are statistically translated into high rates of substance addiction, unemployment, declining health, and shattered families. According to Burgoyne, much of the analytical tension in this book focuses on how individuals deal with the forces that oppresses them. Another social marginalization of El Barrio is that violence, drug abuse, and felons have always been around, and it didn't matter what immigrant ethnic group lived there. Drugs being on every street corner in El Barrio and the price of drugs being so cheap made it easily accessible to anyone that sought them. In Chapter 3, Burgoyne describes the roles and responsibilities of the people in the industry of drug dealing. Ray, one of the head drug dealers at the time, ran the game room that the drugs were being sold out of. Primo was right under Ray, as some would call his right-hand man, getting privileges runners, people who sold drugs on the street corners like Pete and Benzie did not have, like money for legal fees, bonus payments, and a slew of luxurious amenities. One major reason drug dealers did not seek legal employment was because the jobs that were available to them at the time were not of livable wages. Burgoyne stated that the economists and sociologists have documented statistically that the restructuring of the U.S. economy around service jobs has resulted in unemployment, income reduction, weaker unions, and dramatic erosions in workers' benefits at the entry level. This means that on top of minimum wage jobs, some, if not most, factory jobs, which was the main income of El Barrio residents, were being replaced by service industries. One of the main reasons for poverty and marginalization in El Barrio being so maintained by its residents is because their only constant is alternating between street-level drug dealing and minimum wage employment. To most, drug dealing gave them a sense of free will and not having to obey the white man, as some people will put it. For most people who did want to find decent legal employment, that was nearly impossible with a criminal record and no high school diploma, like for Burgoyne's informant Primo. In the 1990s, the recession also made job availability scarce in the El Barrio community. The discouragement of not having a legal job and thriving in society deteriorated people like Cesar and Primo. And when they did have legal jobs, they were belittled by being called illiterate and seen as incapable of doing anything except for hard labor. Falling prey to one of the recurring economic downturns that characterize this extremely specialized subsector, which varies according to the shifting fads and whims of upper class culture, which in turn caused them to spiral deeper into the world of drugs selling and drug use, quickly becoming addicts themselves, using different drugs and drinking every day. It was a never-ending cycle. The drug sellers more than likely becomes the drug users. The very basis of street culture and the willingness of the individuals like Primo and Caesar to compromise their street identity is a refusal to accept the marginalization in the professional world. However, not all kinds of resistance to marginal legal work are as effective. Although rare, there were programs like free job training within El Barrio, but men like Primo and Caesar felt a sense of shame and vulnerability whenever they attempted to join these kinds of programs. One major reason being their dress style and appearance, and the clothes they wore being labeled as streetwear and not good enough to enter the workforce. Racism also being expressed in the work area due to appearance. The intricate relationships between peer groups, schools, and families are essential to the establishment and upholding of social norms. For example, the generational and cultural divide that had appended and established authority in Primo's household added to his institutional estrangement. His Spanish-speaking mother being unable to communicate with educators in the school system stigmatized Primo as being uncooperative and slow-witted. Therefore, Primo developed a defense mechanism by resisting his teachers and not following proper direction in order to excel. This is what many children growing up in the inner city fell victim to, even African Americans, minus the language barrier Puerto Ricans had to face. Some people, like Caesar, were doomed from birth to live a life of drugs and violence. His mother getting pregnant by different men, being addicted to drugs, in and out of jail, all foreshadowed Caesar's would-be lifestyle. From being born addicted to heroin, getting mentally and physically abused transformed Caesar into a rebellious and violent adolescent in and out of school. There was a clear distinction that in street culture, women and men were not created equally. Gender-based brutality was widely known to be the norm in El Barrio. Many women and girls were raped and gang raped for simply being easily accessible to the men and adolescent boys around them. This was the norm in the street culture of El Barrio. Men boasted and told stories of fully taking advantage of women, mainly blaming them for the rape or gang rape. Crime was a major part of street culture, especially in groups. Some people say they wouldn't have done half the stuff they did if they were alone, from stealing cars to robbing innocent people within the community, eventually escalating to home burglaries. As men began to lose their previous authority in the household by being in the streets and abandoning their families, women began to step up in a more dominant role in the family structure. Women could no longer count on men to take care of the basic needs in the household, so the women in turn began contributing to both roles, which infuriated the men who could not uphold the man of the house structure, causing a severe spike in domestic violence. Women are excluded from the more lucrative and unrestricted business niches like dealing, mugging, and burglarizing by the male-dominated underground economy. But Candy, one of two women who sold drugs for Ray, the owner of the game room, talks of commanding respect on the streets, portraying herself in an aggressive manner so not to seem weak, was one of many ways Candy demanded respect from her male counterparts. From being abused physically as a child until age 13 when she met her husband and got pregnant, abuse was all she knew. Soon her husband took over the role of abuser from age 13 to 32, having 5 miscarriages due to her husband's beatings. Trying to commit suicide numerous times, she knew with her husband gone and incarcerated, she had to step up into the dominant role and take care of herself, therefore becoming more masculine and aggressive. Government assistance like welfare was originally intended to aid people in poverty to help better their situation by giving them money for food, like food stamps. But for people like Candy and many others, it held them back or came a day too late. While on welfare, you have to make below a certain amount of income per paycheck. If you made too much in the state's eyes, you would either owe them money or your case will be closed because they felt that you did not need their assistance. As for Candy, by the time she did receive welfare, she was past the point of legal income and in order to afford a living for her family, had to resort to selling drugs. For majority of women, instead of drug dealing, women turn to prostitution as a means of illegal income, bringing in fast money just like their drug dealing male counterparts do. While two different forms of illegal activities both generate a slew of diseases, for prostitutes, STDs and STIs are at an all-time high, while drug use and sharing needles creates an opening for HIV and other bodily fluid transmission for disease. From babies being born to women with drug habits and having crack in their system at birth, absent fathers in the household, as well as present fathers abusing the wife and children of the home, these aspects prematurely ruining the family dynamic before a child even has a chance to step foot outside into the real world and having to face drugs, illegal activities, stereotypes, and poverty. The father being the alpha symbol in the household was something children in El Barrio got to experience less and less. Many men created broken homes with their promiscuity, leading women to raise children alone. As Burgos said, a man in El Barrio can no longer speak to his children with his eyes and expect to have his commands immediately obeyed. The formalities of male respect are no longer achievable within the conjugal household or the extended kin-based community. This brings up the question, is it better to have an abusive father who barely can pay the bills, needing help from the mother, or a completely absent father altogether? Most people in El Barrio who shared their stories don't realize the things they've witnessed and went through in childhood and adulthood are very traumatic and far from normal. Most see it as means to an end, while growing up in poverty eventually becoming their norm, causing them to be desensitized to these traumatic events. Ultimately, there's only a few places the street life or street culture will get you once you're involved, and that's dead, jail, addicted to or selling drugs, teenage pregnancy, and or a lifetime of full trauma.